ravaging the East since 1937 and Japan's invasion of China, reached Europe on the 1st of September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. It became global on the 7th of December 1941 when Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. It touched every continent and lasted for 6 years. It ended with a new weapon for a new age. This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire. The new empires of East and West, Japanese and German, had reached their furthest limits in the course of 1942. And there was, in the minds of some, an extraordinary vision that Japan, spreading west, would link hands with Germany, thrusting east. The conquerors would meet in the Indian subcontinent. But as 1942 wore on, both Germany and Japan would suffer setbacks, which meant, as Winston Churchill was to say, if not the beginning of the end, then the end of the beginning. In May 1942, Japan's imperial ambitions had been checked at sea. Battle of Midway may not have turned the tide, but it stopped the flood, and the tide turned as the gap widened between the abilities of the two sides to re-equip and resupply. The United States, which was to provide the Grand Coalition with 75% of its war material, demonstrated a remarkable capacity to deliver to its armed forces and its allies in apparently limitless quantities. It was said that America by 1943 was producing a tank every 5 minutes, an aeroplane every half hour, and an aircraft carrier every week. Germany had always known that the longer the war went on, the more remote its hopes of victory. But on the 28th of June 1942, hopes were high. As we have seen, Plan Blue, launched against the weakest Soviet troop concentration, the Southern Front, the gateway to the Caucasus, made good progress. Stalin had been warned of the offensive by British intelligence and by a complete German battle plan taken from a downed German aircraft. He had dismissed all these warnings as misinformation. Stalin waited for the attack on Moscow to be renewed, but he got the plan that Hitler favoured, and his troops fell back in disarray, which encouraged Hitler to make the call that many consider his costliest error. He divided his force. With the Crimea taken, he sent Army Group A along the Black Sea coast, aiming for the crucial oil cities of Maikop, Grozny and Baku. Within 12 days, it had advanced more than 550 kilometers. Hitler ordered Army Group B to advance on Stalingrad.
И отправили ее под Сталинград. 24-я армия. Доехали до Камышина на поезде. Дальше пути были все разрушены. И от Камышина до Сталинграда тоже шли пешком. Это примерно 100 километров. Причем двигались только ночью. Это был август месяц 1942 года. Двигались ночью, днем немцы бомбили всякое движение. Но где же наши самолеты? Такая мысль, ну почему ни одного самолета нет нашего, только немцы преобладают?
In the initial bombing of Stalingrad, a period of just 2 days, at least 40,000 Soviet citizens had been killed. When the assault on the city began, Russia's anti-aircraft guns had been entrenched for use on the advancing tanks. The gun crews were almost all young women, and they were almost all killed. 1.5 million Soviet women served in the armed forces, around 490,000 of them in frontline roles, where they were granted one benefit not available to their male comrades: an additional 100 grams of soap. On August the 19th, Army Group B began its assault on Stalingrad. Within 4 days, it had reached the suburbs. What could possibly go wrong?
Под Ленинградом я весил 48 килограмм. Голодный. Тяжелый фронт. И я всегда вспоминаю его так с болью.
Stalin's Order Number 227 simply said that the Red Army was to stand its ground. It said that retreat means death. It worked. Other measures announced by Stalin helped. He reopened the churches. He spoke of the sacred motherland rather than the party. For the first time since the revolution, officers were to be addressed by rank, and the role of the political commissar was reduced to the point of irrelevance. In late August, Stalin appointed General Georgy Zhukov, the 42-year-old son of a shoemaker, deputy supreme commander, and sent him to Stalingrad. Stalingrad had been named Tsaritsyn until 1925, when it was given Stalin's name to commemorate his role in its defense during the Revolutionary Wars. The salvation of the city that bore his name was a matter of personal pride for the Soviet leader, and its destruction became a similarly illogical obsession for the Führer. Lavrenti Beria, the notorious head of Stalin's secret police, understood this ego dimension. He described the battle as a confrontation between two rands. On August 23rd, von Paulus, commanding the 6th Army, the largest single formation in the Wehrmacht, 290,000 strong, reached the River Volga just north of Stalingrad. The next day, August 24th, Zhukov arrived in Stalingrad. On September the 2nd, Hitler ordered that when the city fell, the entire male population was to be eliminated. Stalingrad sprawled for about 40 kilometers on both sides of the Volga, and at a point where that river was 1,300 meters wide. By the middle of September, Soviet defense was concentrated on a garrison restricted to the West Bank and to an area little more than 15 kilometers wide at its widest point. The Germans had closed to about 200 meters from the river when, at 1700 hours on the 14th of September, General Alexander Rodimtsev led the 10,000 men of his 13th Guards Rifle Division across the Volga and in a charge up the steep river bank. There were 320 survivors. By the end of September, 9/10 of Stalingrad was in German hands. It proved not to be enough.
А в одном случае, когда наша артиллерия не смогла разбить идущий на него «Тигр». Он шел не прямо на наше орудие, они стоят 50 метров примерно одно от другого. Соседнее орудие раздавил. Ну, его, правда, забросали противотанковыми гранатами, он загорелся. Добили танкистов, которые выскочили из горящего «Тигра». Вот. Безжалостно, со стервенением, с руганью. «Тигр» сожгли. Вот. И практически никто не пострадал. Пострадало только одно орудие. Все сюда выкапывают индивидуальные окопчики небольшие. Вот. И каждый прячется в них отдельно.
At the beginning of November, the combination of strengthening Soviet resistance and the traditional Russian ally, winter, halted the advance by von Kleist's Panzer Army into the Caucasus at Ordzhonikidze. As the first ice appeared on the Volga, Marshal Zhukov and the rest of the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, began planning their counterstroke, Operation Uranus. Designed to trap the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Russian army formations were known as fronts. General Vatutin's Southwest Front would attack from the north where it faced the Third Romanian Army. The Stalingrad Front, General Yeremenko, south of the city, also faced Romanians as he drove north, linking with Vatutin at Kalach. The Don Front was commanded by a survivor of Stalin's purges who had been tortured and twice subjected to mock executions. His name was Konstantin Rokossovsky. His task was to apply pressure to Paulus, preventing him from responding to the maneuvering in his rear. These Soviet formations represented a land empire whose population comprised 120 nationalities.
Хацкевич Павел Матвеевич из Белоруссии, доцент Гомельского педагогического института, преподаватель физики и математики. Служил Петрусь, помню только фамилия такая, похожа на имя, украинец. Служил татарин Мубаракшин, который всегда хорошо разделывал конину погибшую. Анатолий Шаруха из далекой Сибири, 700 километров от железной дороги. Впервые увидел поезд только когда призвали в армию. Самые разные люди, которые сжились в один кулак, друг за друга, когда Грузию защищали друг. Вот такой народ. Я не помню всех, конечно.
On the 11th of November 1942, the German assault on Stalingrad was renewed. A week later, the Southwest and Don fronts began their attacks. The Stalingrad front moved the next day. By the end of November the 20th, Vatutin had advanced 40 kilometers. On the 22nd, he captured the bridge over the Don at Kalach, and on the 23rd, the Southwest and Stalingrad fronts linked up just as planned. Zhukov had sent 1 million men, nearly 1,000 tanks and more than 1,000 aircraft against the enemy. 330,000 Axis troops were now trapped in Der Kessel, the cauldron, 55 kilometers by 30. The Romanian Third Army had been destroyed and the Romanian Fourth Army crippled. General Paulus, commanding the besieged army, estimated that he needed an airdrop of 750 tons a day, and Hermann Goering boasted that his Luftwaffe could do the job. Of course, it could not. Goering retired to the Ritz Hotel in Paris. For Hitler, retreat or worse still surrender were not options. His only order to the Sixth Army was to stand fast. On November 27th, Hitler created a new formation, Army Group Don. He placed von Manstein in command and ordered him to relieve the encircled Paulus. At the end of November, the Red Army launched new attacks. A week of heavy fighting forced von Manstein to postpone his planned offensive.
Представляете, это вот такой декабрь, там вот к январю уже двигалось. Я как-то так ужимаюсь, значит, боюсь, как командовать такими взрослыми уже. Может, взрослым там был 25, там 30 лет. Когда выпивать, я говорю, нет, ребят, я не курю, говорю, и вы там и не пью. Так что учтите, что я не буду вас это. Но учтите, что только перед боем, если что, тихо, значит, чтобы вы нормальным, ребята, не напивайтесь, задание будет в бой идти.
In the heart of the Russian winter, they fought street to street, building to building. Rokossovsky said that the German army was a machine, and he said, machines can be broken. People are not machines, but they too can be broken. "13,000 Soviet soldiers were executed for desertion or cowardice during the battle. They were forced to strip before being shot so that their uniforms, destined for recycling, would not contain demoralizing bullet holes." Morale was boosted by the performance of Soviet weapons. The T-34 tank, based on an off-the-shelf design by the American Walter Christie, was the equal of any, and the Katyusha rocket launcher had no equal. It was effective, and it was terrifying. 9 days later than originally planned, on December the 12th, von Manstein finally launched Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. The offensive, carried by Group Hoth, General Hermann Hoth, went well until it met fierce resistance at the Mishkova River. And then the Soviet Second Guards Army, General Malinovsky, was thrown in. Winter Storm was turned back, and von Manstein recognized that his rescue mission had failed. On December the 16th, the Soviets launched an offensive, Little Saturn, against the Italian Eighth Army, which was wiped out. Tatsinskaya, the main airfield used by the Germans for resupply of Stalingrad, was now in Soviet hands. On Christmas Eve, the Stalingrad front broke through the 4th Romanian Army, which had joined Group Hoth, and started to swing towards the lower Don. Von Manstein withdrew Group Hoth.
И, значит, я смотрю, там появились 3 фигуры, встали 3 человека с автоматами. Ну, это были немцы. Они шли и руки подняли вверх. Они понимали, что стрелять бесполезно, сразу их убьют. Когда мы их обыскивали, как говорят, ну вот обратили внимание, что, значит, руки у них обморожены, почерневшие, уши почерневшие, да. А по возрасту это просто какие-то мальчишки, лет по 17-18, вот так. И я обратил внимание, что один из офицеров, это были офицеры, кстати, опускает руку в карман. Я его схватил за руку и говорю, хендахох, а сам проверил, что в кармане. Ну, там граната. Командир дивизиона приказал расстрелять. Его расстреляли.
On December 28th, in view of the deteriorating situation, Hitler permitted 2 army groups to fall back on the line Konstantinov-Salskarmavir. They were now more than 200 kilometers from Stalingrad. It was time for the end game. On the 10th of January 1943, the Soviet assault began. Yeremenko pressed against the east bank of the Volga. An offensive perimeter formed of 6 Soviet armies drew in like a dragnet on the west bank. The 65th Army in the center pushed forward 8 kilometers on the first day. After 2 days, Rokossovsky's Don front coming in from the city's southwest had lost more than 250 tanks and taken 26,000 casualties. By now, airborne resupply to the German forces was down to 40 tons a day. By the 17th, the only airfield from which supplies could be flown fell. On January 23rd, the last German aircraft flew from Stalingrad. 1,000 years hence, Germans will speak of the battle with reverence and awe, Hermann Goering said in a radio broadcast on January 30th. On that day, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered his command, and Hitler no doubt expected the promotion to either guarantee that Paulus would fight to the last man or commit suicide rather than march into captivity. A day later, January the 31st, 1943, General Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus surrendered his command in the southern pocket of the city to Twikov's 62nd Army. I have no intention, von Paulus said, of shooting myself for this Bavarian corporal. The Germans had a name for the sort of fighting that had knocked down the city's buildings. Rattenkrieg, they called it, Rat War. It produced legends like the fighting at the tractor factory, the grain silo, the main railway station which had changed hands 15 times, and Pavlov's house, where Sergeant Pavlov and his unit had held out for 59 days until relieved. But even such heroics must, in the end, be settled by the reality of modern war. When the tractor plant was subjected to a bombardment by artillery massed at a density of 300 guns per kilometer, it surrendered and the Battle of Stalingrad was over. It had lasted 199 days.
Вот. Потому что все время грохот, пулеметные очереди, рвутся снаряды, а тут тишина. Мы завершили. Наступила абсолютная тишина. Даже как-то непривычно было.
On February the 3rd, the Führer announced the fall of the city and declared 4 days of mourning. The official communique announced that the entire 6th Army had been wiped out to the last man and the last bullet. In fact, 91,000 prisoners of war were marched through the streets of Moscow. 5,000 would survive their captivity. Following Stalingrad's surrender, German radio played the Adagio from the 7th Symphony of Anton Bruckner. It would be played again in 1945, following the announcement of Hitler's death. From late in the winter of 1942, German propaganda had been recasting the war. no longer a crusade to destroy Jewish Bolshevism. It was now a life-or-death struggle against the Asiatic horde. In this vein, the great orchestrator of German propaganda made a landmark speech on February the 18th. Joseph Goebbels asked, "Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Do you want total war? Do you want a war more total and radical than even we can imagine?" Those listening on the radio heard the carefully selected audience respond fanatically. They heard Goebbels end with a quotation that Nazi leaders had used since 1920. "Now, people, rise up and let the storm break loose." The storm that had broken over Stalingrad resulted in about 1,130,000 Soviet casualties. Axis forces suffered 850,000. Stalingrad may have checked the tide, but defeat in a battle is not defeat in a war, and the Soviet Union had yet to expel a single invader from its soil. At the end of 1942, German troops were in occupation of 14 sovereign states: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Greece, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Soviet republics of Belarus and Ukraine were occupied, Italy was an ally, and so too were Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Eastern Front remained a contest between two great continental empires. So was Stalingrad decisive? Like Midway, Stalingrad was a battle in which both sides lost heavily. But it proved that the German Empire was not invincible, that Soviet generals were at least a match for their German counterparts, above all, that the Soviet Union alone was able to pay the cost of exorbitantly expensive victories. It would do so again at Kursk when the Wehrmacht, still deep in Soviet territory, would once again go on the offensive. What Stalingrad, along with Midway and the reversal of fortunes in North Africa, did do was persuade people on the Allied side, from the lowest to the highest, that they had turned the corner.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Churchill was referring to the Second Battle of El Alamein. Through July and August, as we have learned, Rommel was checked in North Africa. His newly arrived adversary, Montgomery, was first tested when Rommel launched an offensive with, as his objective, the British fuel depot. Fuel supply to the Afrika Korps was a constant problem. The key to Rommel's plan was a swing against the Alam Halfa Ridge. He was beaten back and in early September withdrew to his start line. Montgomery was determined to build up a superiority in every type of arms before rejoining the fight. Some of the tactics were less than orthodox. Dummy tanks were positioned to persuade observers that the attack was forming in a certain place, and real tanks were also disguised.
There was a framework on the outside of the tanks with canvas on, all painted to look like a lorry, and it did look like a lorry. And there was any number of tanks behind the front line like this. Lorries had been parked in an area, and they'd pull out overnight, and you'd pull in overnight. And this really fooled the Germans quite a bit.
The Second Battle of El Alamein opened on the night of 22nd, 23rd October 1942 with the first significant British bombardment since the end of the First World War.
It
poor Germans, I said, they got it. So Montgomery. He opened up with over 1,000 pieces of artillery on that Alabama line. They came over like hailstones.
The line from which the offensive would move stretched from the coast road south to the impassable Katara Depression. 13th Corps General Horrocks at the southern end of the line would push against General Benvenuto Gioda's 10th Corps. The aim was to draw Rommel's armour south. The main attack would be in the north, 30th Corps General Leese advancing through minefields. New Zealanders and South Africans fought side by side on the southern end of 30th Corps' advance, the New Zealanders scoring an early success with the capture of Miteria Ridge. Up towards the coast, the advance of 9th Australian Division was slowed by the minefield, as was the push from both 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions. On the 25th, Rommel, who had been in Germany for medical treatment when the attack was launched, arrived in Africa and resumed command of the Africa Corps. Both the north and south thrusts of Montgomery's attack stalled on the 25th. The feared 88mm anti-tank weapon was particularly effective. The battle hung in the balance.
The star shells flying everywhere, and there was a lot of whistling going on. So the air was full of it. If you dropped to the ground every time you heard a whistling sound, you'd never get up.
For 2 days, blow and counter-blow were traded without decisive outcome. On the 28th, Churchill expressed his anxiety. Plans for an Allied landing at the western end of the littoral in French North Africa were about to be implemented, and advancing from the east to effect the link-up was vital. On the 29th, Montgomery changed the plan. Supercharge now had the Australian Division on the coast road as the feint. The attack began on November 2nd, 6 days before the landings were scheduled for French North Africa.
Back, I remember there was one tank sitting out in front burning, one of ours, and there was a voice in my ear saying, "Help, help me." The operator on that tank had been on the wireless when his tank was hit, and somebody was trapped in that tank. The wireless was still on. "God's sake, help me." One of our tanks put a shot through the side of it and the voice stopped. That burns inside me, that does. I'm sorry, but...
As Supercharge began to bite into the Axis lines, Rommel, whose forces were desperately short of fuel and ammunition, was obliged to withdraw. The pursuit of Rommel across Libya began on November the 4th, and on the 10th, Churchill declared the end of the beginning.
One morning we saw a lot of burning going on. Another recce troop was sent forward and came back the signal, "Oh, it's a general exodus." In other words, the Germans are pulling back. So we chased them all the way up the coast.
2nd El Alamein was clearly an Allied victory. The enemy was in full-scale retreat. But a sense of proportion is necessary. At the midpoint of 1942, there were 8 Italian and 4 German divisions in North Africa. There were 12 and 5, respectively, in the Balkans, 26 German divisions in Western Europe and 12 in Norway, and 197 Axis divisions on the Eastern Front.
Though Rommel was on the run, he was fighting with all the stubborn skill and resource you'd naturally expect from this general.
As the 8th Army drove west in pursuit of Rommel, it may be said to have represented the last hurrah of a once great empire. On the other side of North Africa, her allies' ground troops were entering the war against Hitler under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Yanks were coming. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, began on November the 8th when landings in 3 places met with strong French resistance. These were forces loyal to the Vichy French government.
There was a French Navy ship that started firing at us. I believe it was the Vichy French who opposed us, and our battleship sunk them at the pier. And all the troop ships had their formation of landing craft gathered together, and they emerged onto the beach. A lot of the LCVPs that carried the troops onto the beach were unable to dock efficiently, so a lot of the troops with their heavy armament on them drowned in the water because of the heavy weight on their shoulder.
General Patton's Western Task Force landed at 3 points on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The Centre Task Force landed at Oran and the eastern, west of Algiers, both in Algeria. On November the 10th, Admiral François Darlan, Vichy High Commissioner in Algiers, ordered an end to resistance to the invasion. Vichy Prime Minister Pierre Laval hurried to Berlin to assure Hitler that Darlan had acted illegally. But the Führer was not impressed, and the next day he ordered German troops to occupy the whole of France, bringing the pretense of the Zone Libre to an end. He sent an explanation of his action to the Vichy leader, Philippe Pétain. "It is to be regretted," he wrote, "that unscrupulous Anglo-Saxons and primarily Jewish wire-pullers succeeded in interpreting every conciliatory gesture of the new Reich as a sign of weakness." Hitler told Pétain that inciters in Paris demanded dismemberment of the German Reich. He complained that they sought the enslavement of the German people, above all, complete restoration of the unrestricted right of plunder by the Jewish race. On the 11th of November 1942, the anniversary of the armistice that had ended the First World War, the French in North Africa signed an armistice with the Allies, who began their advance on Tunis, which would hold out until April, when it became the jumping-off point for the invasion of Sicily. In the Pacific, major campaigns were changing the power balance of the war. An archipelago of almost 1,000 islands, Solomon Islands is critically positioned off the northeastern Cape of Australia. The Japanese called the main island Guadalcanal. The Americans called it Cactus. Its name is Guadalcanal. Japanese troops landed there in April 1942 and were soon observed to be building an airbase. Such a facility could threaten mainland Australia and naval and combined operations throughout the theatre of war. On July the 2nd, the American Chiefs of Staff ordered the capture of Solomon Islands. Little over a month later, on August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first landing by American forces in the Pacific and the first of a series of island names to be indelibly inscribed in American history. The primary target of the Marines who landed on Red Beach was the airstrip that the Japanese had been constructing. When the Marines overran the airfield on August 12th, they named it for one of their number killed in action at Midway, Major Lofton Henderson. Henderson Field became the site of one of the bloodiest of the Pacific battles. The night after the initial landing, a Japanese naval task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer caught an Allied force steaming through the 15-kilometre-wide channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, sinking the American and Australian cruisers with the loss of 1,270 Allied seamen and 34 Japanese dead. Following the Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without support. But the Japanese allowed their opportunity to pass, not bringing up reinforcements until August the 18th. The first Japanese counterattack went in on August the 21st. They attacked at night because they believed that Americans, being effeminate, did not like fighting at night. 900 men commanded by Colonel Ishiki attacked at the Battle of Tenaru River. The Japanese were wiped out. The Americans lost 35 men. Colonel Ishiki committed harakiri, ritual suicide, and it is said that crocodiles feasted on the Japanese corpses. Later in August, continuing naval action in the waters around the Solomons swung the advantage there back to the Americans, whose fighters were by now operating from Henderson Field. Supply to Imperial Japanese Army troops on Guadalcanal was thereafter limited to vessels travelling from Bougainville at night. The Americans dubbed it the Tokyo Night Express. The next significant attempt to displace the Marines was led by General Kawaguchi. The Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September was fiercely contested. The Japanese were driven back with 600 dead. The Marines lost 150 men. By late September, Marine strength under General Vandergrift had risen to 23,000. The Japanese, recognizing the struggle that they faced, sent Lieutenant General Hyukutake from Rabaul with the 17th Army. By mid-October, the Japanese had built their force to about 20,000. The battle for Guadalcanal raged from mid-October until the final Japanese evacuation at the beginning of February 1943. In the first 2 weeks of December, the 1st US Marine Division, severely debilitated by 6 weeks of fighting and the depredations of tropical disease, was relieved by 3 Marine divisions of 14th Corps, General Alexander Patch. Patch began offensive operations almost at once, and by early January, Japan realized that its position on Guadalcanal was not supportable. Losses to hunger and disease were far outstripping losses to enemy action. Evacuation was ordered, the troops to be taken to New Guinea. By early February, 1,600 Americans had been killed, as many as 32,000 Japanese had been lost to military action or disease. The Imperial Japanese Army had fared no better during the parallel campaign on New Guinea.
Now for a dispatch from the jungles of New Guinea by an Australian newsreel cameraman just back from the front, Damien Parra.
It's an uncanny sort of warfare. You never see a Jap even though he's only 20 yards away. They're complete masters of camouflage and deception. I should say about 40% of our boys wounded in those engagements. I haven't seen a Japanese soldier, a live one anyway.
In July 1942, a small formation comprising 1 Australian and 1 Papuan infantry battalion was sent from Port Moresby on the overland journey to Buna, on New Guinea's north coast. Buna had a small airfield which General Douglas MacArthur determined he needed as a base for further operations. The small force that set off was named for one of Sydney's better beaches, Maroubra Force. Its journey lay along the Kokoda track, across the vertiginous and densely jungled Owen Stanley Ranges. Maroubra Force reached the village of Kokoda, about the halfway point of the track, in mid-July. Its orders from MacArthur were to move on Buna at the end of the month. Frustrated by the Battle of the Coral Sea in their plans to take Port Moresby from the Gulf of Papua, the Japanese decided to approach overland. A 2,000-man advance detachment under Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama landed at Gona on July 21st. Its orders were to make for Kokoda. The first contact between the Japanese and Maroubra force occurred 2 days later. The 7th Australian Division was dispatched to Papua in early August, and in the middle of the month, one brigade began to move up the track. The journey along Kokoda was a journey into the malaria zone, and for every man that was wounded, 7 were incapacitated by sickness. Supplying troops on the track was also problematic. In the 8 days it took native bearers to reach frontline troops, they necessarily consumed half of the food that they carried. 2 days after the Australian 7th was dispatched, the main Japanese force of 11,500 men landed at Buna. By war's end, 157,646 Japanese soldiers would have been sent to New Guinea. Barely 6% of them were to survive.
One important scene of action has been Milne Bay. Our pictures show reinforcements arriving after the Japanese attempt to gain a foothold had been broken by Australians.
There was contact made with the Japanese for 4 nights when they would come and set up a machine gun alongside of a tree just across the runway. As fast as one would get killed there, another would take his place. They would do that for a number of hours. In the meantime, we had troops, infantry over their side, and gradually they got the upper hand. And they left 88 dead. There was a Japanese that had been machine gunned across his stomach, and he had both hands in there, and the pain of the agony was still on his face. You had to think of somebody's son, somebody's father, or somebody's husband.
By September the 6th, the attempted invasion of Milne Bay had to be abandoned. Japanese troops were evacuated back to Rabaul. Milne Bay was the first outright defeat of Japanese troops. Importantly, it denied them the opportunity to establish an air base. After 2 more weeks of fierce fighting, the Australians began to advance along the Kokoda track. Their objective, Buna, fell to them after weeks of vicious jungle fighting in atrocious conditions of heat, humidity and disease. In the Papua New Guinea campaign, the Allies lost 8,500 as battle casualties, the Japanese 12,000. Both sides lost many more to disease. Progress had been slow and the cost high, but the threat to Australia had been removed. In the next episode of The Price of Empire, the change of fortunes that has led to Allied victories gains in impetus. Through 1943, in the seas, the skies, in Eastern Europe, in Italy and North Africa, on the Eastern Front and through the Pacific, there is a steady grinding away at the Axis powers. If 1942 had seen the end of the beginning, this was perhaps the beginning of the end.